Apogee opened 1993 with a game called Major Striker, that's Striker with a Y as in Mortal Kombat. Before I say anything about the game, I want to give it special notice for being the first to do this. This was the first appearance of the Apogee theme tune, and it would be adapted a little for most games that followed. This was the point where they finally had a consistent branding after experimenting with several different logos and splash screens during the last few years. This is another new genre for Apogee. It's a vertical scrolling shooter developed by Alan H. Bloom III and others with less implausible names who worked on Duke Nukem. Once again, it's presented in 16-colour EGA, which was seriously getting on a bit by this point, being nearly 10 years old and having been superseded by VGA when the original Cross came out. The story goes that Earth has just been through a Third World War and has a severely reduced population as a result. In this situation, an alien race called the Cretons take the opportunity to pop through a wormhole and attack the survivors. On a mission to repel them, you play as Major Striker, a veteran of World War III who has spent a bit too much of his subsequent free time on a sunbed. You go through 3 episodes in the form of unimaginatively named planets, with your Fleet Admiral Yoshira available to keep track of your innuendo supplies. The game plays like you would expect a shoot 'em up to go. You scroll up the screen, firing upon enemy installations and ships that are coming the other way, and collecting pickups to enhance your weapons and shields. The weapon selection is based on collecting consecutive pickups. You'll slowly gain firepower with each one until you end up spewing out lasers in all directions. However, if you're hit at any point, you go all the way back to having one puny little laser, and it feels somehow unfair to be much weaker and suddenly have far less chance of getting on your feet again once you've taken just one piece of damage. Adding to the difficulty, the grid-based movement feels frustratingly imprecise, especially as your ship's hitbox is far too large. When a lot of bullets are on the screen, trying to get through without damage feels like manoeuvring a truck over a disastrous supermarket crisp spillage. There are also sections where you go forward at double speed, and just like in Cosmo's Cosmic Adventure, the lack of distinction in the EGA palette means that it's nearly impossible to see where you're going. The levels are a bit too long to be comfortable belting the fire button all the way through them for 5 full minutes, and they should probably come with some sort of RSI warning. It's telling that the registered version's rapid fire cheat code is used as a selling point multiple times in the game's help files. To counteract the difficulty level, the game reminds you to save often, but this doesn't help because it restores you at the start of the levels and not exactly where you saved. When I entered no name for one of the saves, it automatically changed it to I am losing, which I felt was a bit rude. Anyway, once you've run out of lives, you're treated to a sample from aliens. I seem to have been focusing on a lot of negative points, but I did like some things about the game. There's a nice amount of variety in the enemies and the environments that you fly through, and the 3 tiers of scrolling are nice, particularly the way that you can see some ships flying below you and they can rise up and switch layers to attack. The soundtrack also has some great examples of MIDI rock, courtesy of Bobby Prince again, but there's a far slicker game from the next year that I can't help comparing this to because I played it obsessively when it came out. We'll look at Raptor in the next video. Monster Bash is a return to Apogee's staple, the side-scrolling action platformer, but this one has some new elements that make it quite unique and interesting. You play as Johnny Dash, a boy who is the same colour as his hat and sporting some enviable spotty pyjamas, and you have to fight your way through graveyards and haunted woods stuffed with hordes of undead creatures, rescuing the pets that they've taken from the human world and are planning to turn into their horrifying servants. It's an unusually dark and gory game considering the fare we've seen before, with vague putrefied body parts flying everywhere and morbid horror-themed scenery like these worms and/or entrails impaled on bloodied spikes. Your method of defense against these legions of the underworld is a small catapult like Dennis the Menace, which fires pebbles and occasional guided missiles. Rather than having a weapon that just fires in the traditional straightforward direction, this means that your shots are affected by gravity, and you'll have to line up some trick shots off walls and ceilings to clear the levels of dangers. Pickups, aside from the missiles, are a triple shot and one that fires giant boulders that split into more stones on impact. The game was written by Frank Madden, who had previously done Crystal Caves and who dressed up as Johnny Dash for the Apogee Halloween party in 1996 in this photo, for which I apologise. He said his aim was to make a console-style platform game, something he'd been inspired to do by Commander Keen, and it definitely shows. Johnny's movement has a satisfying amount of momentum to it. You struggle up hills, but you can run at full tilt down the way, and you can jump higher and further if you've taken a run-up. There are also another couple of platform game features that hadn't appeared in Apogee games before, including doors you can step into to reach other parts of the level, and Mother of Mercy, restart points. These are particularly helpful as the levels are large and you can be hunting through the levels for pets for some time. This Gigas backgrounded cavern one in the first episode, for example, takes absolutely years. You do get the advantage of a compass that shows you where the nearest pet is, but it doesn't take walls in the way or areas only accessible by teleports into account, so the help it provides is vague at best. But the levels have a good variety to them, breaking up the action with some puzzles involving pushing blocks around or stopping the huge stone monsters in the right place so you can stand on them. Some moments are almost adventure game-like, specifically Colossal Cave, as this one involves you having to find a flask and then give water to the shoots in the ground to sprout them into mighty climbable vines. There are enemies that look like giant pairs of boots that you have to use to launch yourself diagonally, as I was so adept at doing in Super Metroid, and to my intense amusement, the knife-throwing hands in the walls can accidentally hit other monsters that wander into the way. You can pick up a few large bonuses for how many monsters you bashed, or for collecting all the pickups on the level, shooting all the red skulls with boggle eyes, or beating the par time. I don't think that anyone really gave a toss about score even when the game was released, but reaching score targets also means you're awarded extra lives, which are a valuable resource in this difficult game. I had played Monster Bash before from a magazine cover disc, but it was a cut-down version that only included the first 3 levels of even the shareware episode. This was a light version that was prepared by Apogee because a game taking up 1 whole megabyte was considered a bit of a large download at the time. So after being confined to the very start of the game for so long, seeing what lay beyond that barrier was a world of surprises. What surprised me a bit more was that after finishing the first level, the game popped up an error message about fileid.diz. It told me it was missing and critical to the game, which is a lie, it's a text file, and it dumped me back to the title screen. This is another innovation for Apogee, and it's an unfortunate one. It's an early form of what you might call digital rights management, or DRM. This is a term for getting a program to run a test to try to ascertain if the game has been bought legally rather than copied or downloaded from somewhere it shouldn't have been. In this case, 3D Realms packaged the wrong version of their fileid.diz with the Anthology, is the one that's meant to come with the shareware version. Here's a bit of a soapbox to pad out the video. As far as I'm concerned, there's only one right way to implement DRM, and that's not to do it, because it comes back to bite you 100% of the time. Don't misunderstand me here. If someone uploads your game to a torrent site after you've told them not to, I think it should be perfectly legal to stick their tongue to a frozen lamppost and then hurl infinite Lego bricks at them. But what happens when you put actual checks like this in your game is always the same. The game's out for maybe 2 days if you're lucky, then somebody circumvents the protection, uploads it anyway, and everyone goes for the cracked version instead because it's so much easier to deal with than your real one, where you have to have the CD in the drive or be continually connected to the internet to play or whatever. The actual purpose of fileid.diz is for the bulletin boards where you used to download these games. They would typically look for a file by that name and use it as some introductory text to explain what the archive was. In Monster Bash's case, the registered one is a fairly alarming notice that you've pirated this software, as they only ever expected it to be displayed on the boards as a warning that somebody had uploaded the full game and not looked out on your own computer. Nevertheless, it feels uncomfortably like you're being accused of something illicit just for playing the game. In this case, they are of course justified in that accusation, because I was able to continue by copying over the correct fileid.diz from a site that had pirated the game some years previously. I let 3D Realms know, and bearing in mind my own pace of putting up videos, it might have been fixed by the time you're listening to this. The next game that Apogee released started off with the name Biohazard, but by the time of its release it had been changed to Menace. It's just as well that that name wasn't already taken, because they would have had to downgrade it further to Biomischief. It was written almost entirely by Jim Norwood, an independent developer who had got involved with Apogee when he asked if he could get his hand on the Commander Keen code. In the end, this game came about as the product of a not entirely successful attempt at the concept of engine licensing by id Software. If you're not familiar with the wild world of coding, games, and ideally most other things, aren't usually written as one lump of stuff. The aim is to separate the duties of pieces of code as much as possible so that you can swap them in and out without affecting other parts of the program. Broadly speaking, on one layer you have the core of the game. This would include code that handles things like storing and loading levels, playing sound and music, support for game-related physics like gravity and how to move objects around and so on, and generally the code that holds the framework of the game together. Sitting on top of that, you have the code that handles things particular to the individual game, for example how Commander Keen's pogo stick bounces, or how the particular enemies are to behave. Then you have the assets themselves, the sprite artwork and level layouts that form the actual game on top of the engine. This is what Pharaoh's Tomb and so on were talking about when they mentioned the fast engine. The idea is that you can reuse the bottom layer so that you don't have to write the basics from scratch every time, speeding up development and giving you a solid base to work from. And it also gives you a sellable product if you can license it to other companies who are interested in using that engine. id Software attempted to do this with the Commander Keen 4 code, getting several developers together to show them around the engine and giving them the chance to adopt it for their own games. In the end, Menace was the only game to come out of that arrangement, but the idea of selling game engines would later work out for id Software in a big way with their next project, Doom. Being a solo project, Menace took 2 years to complete and ended up being the last EGA game to release by Apogee, so enjoy the 16 colours while they last. But to be fair, it used the colour palette pretty well, and you would really have to be concentrating by pausing the game and counting the colours on each individual screen screen to notice. This time you play as a forgotten Super Mario brother who is a CIA agent with the eerily prophetic name of Snake Logan. In the game's story, there's recently been a lot of progress in the field of mutating giant aggressive insects for no apparent purpose, and as you would reasonably expect, the evil Dr. Mangle has stolen the research for his own nefarious purposes and let them loose on the metropolitan area. At the beginning of the game, Snake's plane is shot down over the city, so he has to make it through the mutant-infested streets, rescuing hostages and eventually sneaking inconspicuously into Dr. Mangle's base in his luminous green shirt. Again, this game tilts a little more towards the realistic violence camp, as much you can call man-sized green mutants with mohawks realistic at all. There's no bouncing around on enemies here, you're given a machine gun and a supply of grenades and just have to shoot at them until their eyeballs pop out. Just like in Monster Bash, there are multiple weapons. You have to keep yourself stocked up on ammunition, because if you run out, you're reduced to firing pathetic little bursts of wind at the enemies until you find another clip. Special pickups include explosive ammunition and plasma bolts, while you can bolster your grenade supply with red ones that burst into flame and travel across the screen, or landmines. Annoyingly, you can't switch weapons. If you find yourself in a situation where you need to throw something over a wall but you have 10 landmines, you have to use them all up before getting access to your grenades again. You also don't take your stock of ammunition between levels, which is disappointing if you've got 10 clips, but it means you're not tempted to save them up too much. This information is presented in a score box that takes up far too much of the screen at the top left and will block your view irritatingly, especially when heading up ladders. You can turn it off, but if you do that, then you don't have a way of checking your health or the ammunition you have, even by checking the pause window. The game has a decent number of bonuses hidden in the walls, and secret levels are accessed this time by picking up hidden blue gems on certain levels. Unexpectedly, some of them are much more difficult than the regular levels, and you're liable to die on them quite a lot. You can also usually find a heap of power-ups behind a barrier where you need to put in the combination found elsewhere in the level. This is a nerve-wracking moment when a wrong move will dump you into spikes, release a swarm of bees, or do something equally unpleasant. The other feature given a starring role in this game is the vast collection of doors scattered about the levels, making it look like a shareware version of Haggleman, if I can be allowed to make a joke about a game that made with 3 people in the US bought. They can be unlocked by collecting the universally standard keys scattered around the level and can open into cupboards containing bonuses or coloured shards that let you operate switches or passageways to other parts of the level. As you can't tell what doors are important, this can make using your keys a bit of a lottery. You don't know whether you're wasting your key on collecting a little test tube that gives you 200 points or a vital item to complete the level. I don't think that there are any key shortages on levels leading to unwinnable situations, but at the very least you'll have to hunt to the corners of the levels for extra keys if you open the wrong doors at first. Nevertheless, the smoothness of the Commander Keen engine gives Menace a very solid base, and it feels pretty satisfying to play. There's a decent amount of variety in the game's levels, with some of them being based on exploration and others almost beat-em-up-like, getting through a horde of robots or mutants by any means necessary. Despite being dated when it came out, it was enough of a success for Jim Norwood to lead to him doing other projects with Apogee as well. Halloween Harry is not the title that's showing at the bottom of the screen at the moment, I'll explain that in a minute, but it was Apogee's first side-scrolling platform game in VGA, instantly making it look miles ahead of many of their other games. It also included mod format music, a file type that allowed for customised and much more varied instruments compared to the general MIDI music that had appeared in Apogee games up until then, and the combination of the two gives the game a much more Amiga arcadey feel. It was written by 2 teams from Australia that were new to the Apogee fold, Interactive Binary Illusions, which was a partnership between John Passfield and Steve Stamatiadis, and Sub-Zero Software, who nobody seems to know anything about at all. The game is a sort of cross between Menace and Duke Nukem. This time you play as a not fantastically charismatic action space hero nicknamed Halloween Harry for reasons that are left up to the player's imagination. Unusually for a platform hero, he lacks the ability to jump, but he compensates for this by having a pack of fuel on his back that can either be used as a jetpack or a flamethrower. As explained through some well-drawn but cringeworthily blandly written dialogue scenes, your mission is once again to drop into a city, eliminate the mutants and rescue the hostages. The levels in this game feel a little smaller and more homogeneous than in other games released this year, but they're not at all short because you have to hunt through each one for the large collection of people to rescue. You'll also have to hit switches and double back on yourself a lot, even aided with the presence of your radar. Enemies will respawn pretty much as soon as you're off the screen, which keeps you on your toes no matter how many times you visited the same section of a level. Multiple weapons are available, somewhat curiously being sold by vending machines that are standing around throughout the office blocks and sewers that make up the levels. You can get flamethrower stroke jetpack fuel for free, but other weapons need to be bought using the coins that are dropped by the unfortunate former humans that you encounter. These include lasers, rockets and grenades, though none of them feel quite as satisfying to use as they could be. In particular, the flamethrower lacks any sort of burn and 80 sound to go along with it, making the whole thing feel pretty lifeless. Because you spend a lot of time on each level, you can be set back a very long way if the mutants get the better of you. Save points are provided, but they don't work. When you're out of energy, you get a glimpse of what looks like a hideous Mode 40 error message, followed by the game restarting the level over. I've read that there's a patch for this somewhere, but that it broke other aspects of the game by accident or something and therefore wasn't included in the release. Therefore, I'd recommend playing this one on easy mode to save frustration. Unfortunately, this game didn't get the interest that Apogee had hoped for, and so they've rebranded it as Alien Carnage a few versions after its initial release, thinking that the Halloween Harry title might be unintentionally suggesting it was a seasonal game. However, it's more likely that it was hurt by the anticipation surrounding the release of Doom that was happening at the time. As part of this move, for some reason the first and third of the 4 episodes were swapped around, and it really shows. The now third episode conspicuously gives you a tutorial message about the basic goals of the game and things like how to pull switches, instructions that are now missing from the game's earliest stages if you play them in order. Even with the episode swap in mind, the game expects you to be very adept at finding hidden passages and switches from the very start, and beginning players will most likely spend a long time just lost. I certainly did. I talked about game engines a few minutes ago, and the code for Wolfenstein's 3D handling was one that id was more successful in licensing to others, with several games from various companies built on its code. This one's called Blakestone Aliens of Gold, and it was written by Jam Productions, a company founded by the former department heads of, guess what, Gamer's Edge from Soft Disk Publishing. Blakestone is an allegedly British futuristic Secret Service agent who looks slightly styled on comic heroes of the mid-20th century. In fact, the game comes with a short comic book explaining the story so far. For the third game in a row, it's about the consequences of genetic experimentation. You would think it had been banned by now. The first news something is wrong is when a signal is received from the Ceylon colony about an outbreak of some creature from the Star Institute genetics lab. At first it appears to be an accident, but as usual the reality is a doctor with world domination plans is using the research for his own purposes, so Blake flings his trousers at his underling and jets off to break into the institute and fight his way up to confront the doctor. In game terms, this means that on each floor you have to find the red keycard and then get back to the building's solitary lift to continue. I wouldn't want to be stuck on the top floor at rush hour. Each episode takes place in a different building as you pursue Dr. Goldfire around the Institute's outposts. As usual, each level has background music by Bobby Prince, who frequently borrowed quite heavily from rock songs for his Doom soundtrack and did much the same thing here. The game looks and plays a bit like a science fiction Wolfenstein 3D. The controls are virtually identical, but this time with a ton of shortcuts placed absolutely bloody everywhere on the keyboard, so you can't customize it easily if you want to use the mouse. But despite the similarities at first glance, Blakestone builds a surprising amount on top of the base game. Graphically, the floor and ceiling are no longer plain, they can have different textures per floor, which combined with the greater number of objects and wall textures gives the game a bit more variety than its predecessor. Because the game is based around a central elevator, you can also revisit floors that you've already cleared. Admittedly, I'm not totally sure why you'd want to, as the objective is always to get to the highest floor, but the option is there if you want to pick up untouched health or ammunition, or maybe look for secrets. I'm also impressed that the game keeps track of the picked up state of every item and whether all the enemies are still there. It must surely have pushed the size of the saved game files up a bit. The display at the bottom of the screen is significantly larger than in Wolf 3D. It shows the keycards you have, your current weapon and ammunition, along with a readout of your heartbeat, which I used to find profoundly frightening for some reason. On the left, there's also a status panel that shows how many food tokens you have to spend at the building's frequently out-of-order vending machines, and it changes when you're being hurt to show you the type of enemy that's attacking you, which frankly doesn't help an extraordinary amount. The most interesting thing it does, though, is allow you to talk to some of the building's occupants. Informants in lab coats have been placed around each episode, and if you run up to them and hit the spacebar, they might provide you with hints, ammunition, or food tokens so you can top up your health. If the scientist you talk to is not an informant, he'll quickly realise you're not supposed to be there and open fire, so it's a good idea to react first. Of course, you can make mistakes as well. If you shoot an informant, he'll keel over and shout in a painfully ludicrous attempt at a British accent. You lose the bonuses he might have given you, but you suffer no real penalty because all British people are interchangeable. Enemies and their behaviour have also been enhanced. There are an absolute ton of them, both human guards and mechanical and mutant enemies. Many of the aliens have projectile acid attacks you'll have to watch out for, and the higher ranked officers will sometimes feign death so that they can catch you off guard when you walk past them. So like in Wolfenstein, it's easy to be ambushed and have your health absolutely wrecked by just a couple of attacks. There's also some harmful scenery that you can use to your advantage, like laser gates that keep the mutant experiments contained, and you can sort of make an attempt at stealth by sneaking past enemies like the ceiling-mounted gun turrets when they're not looking. I never said it was a good attempt. Blakestone is a solid game and one that's still pretty enjoyable now. It had some surprisingly modern ideas for a first-person shooter at the time, and while it's not exactly Half-Life, it's still nice to have a sense that you're not in a completely mute world that's just a set of enemy-stuffed levels. It takes the Wolfenstein 3D idea and builds on it nicely without just being a clone. On the very same day Blake Stone was released, Duke Nukem came back in a sequel. 1 year after defeating Dr. Proton in the original game, he's on television promoting his autobiography when he's suddenly captured by aliens who are after his brain to power their war computers. Now, I don't want to pick holes in this plan immediately, but the brain isn't exactly the first thing that I would choose someone like Duke for. As soon as he's connected up to their machinery, it's going to just start madly printing out the words babes, big guns, and perhaps I am a massive twat repeatedly. Whichever way, he explodes his way out almost immediately and you take control as he escapes from his prison cell. As a side note, when I played Duke Nukem when I was young, I didn't know Duke was a given name and just assumed that he was some unusually muscular member of the aristocracy. The sequel was put together by more or less the same people as the first game, but because it used a sound card this time, it had the addition of a soundtrack by Bobby Prince, who can really just be assumed to have written every piece of music for every shareware game from now on. In other changes from the first game, everything's just a little bit bigger and bolder, and you get the sense that this is a very important title for Apogee. There's full screen artwork in the story and loading screens, and you go through a large selection of different environments rather than the game reusing the same few. This level in Episode 4 is particularly unique, being played almost entirely on the undercarriage of an alien spacecraft. The movement and physics are still grid-based, but the levels look more organic than they did before, with things like rocks in the caves being grounded and extending over the strict boundaries of the grid lines. A nice addition, though, is the new ability to shoot up. It sounds like such a simple thing, but it really makes the game much more playable, especially when dealing with flying enemies who hover above you. Levels aren't all just about getting to the end anymore. On some of them, you have little missions like finding and destroying all the satellite dishes in the area. As was becoming common in Apogee games, this time around you have multiple weapons to discover which have varying degrees of destruction, from your standard laser pistol all the way up to a rocket launcher. You can't hurt yourself with any of these, but particularly when rampaging around with the heavier weapons, the game often flings things around at a tremendous rate and it can get difficult to keep up trying to make out what you're doing among the falling buildings, billowing dust clouds and nuclear explosions. You can also take control of vehicles to increase your firepower even further, but you still have to watch your health even though it's tempting to just hold the forward and fire buttons. Another thing that doesn't quite keep up with the action is the scrolling, which makes an attempt at being fluid instead of stapling the player into the middle of the screen, but often it doesn't follow you around quite enough and it has to be corrected using the page up or page down keys to give you a hope of seeing what you're jumping into. The game in the anthology is the Steam release, which retroactively gave Duke his signature sunglasses, which he uses to cover up the evidence of his rampant substance abuse. There is, however, a patch available for people who are fans of eyes, which restores the graphics to their original state. Either way, Duke Nukem 2 is expectedly solid platforming fare from Apogee, even though for some reason it doesn't seem to hold my attention quite as much as the other games. We've seen a ton of side-scrolling platformers so far, but this would rather sadly be the last year that Apogee's catalogue was so heavy on them. As the capabilities of the PC advanced, and particularly in the wake of the release of Doom, shareware games were beginning to change and experiment with new ideas to make themselves stand out in the growing market.